We've been discussing the qualifications of the elder, and that's found in 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. So we got through the first 12, and we discussed those pretty much in detail, but I did skip one, and I got that marked. I did miss the orderly. So the fifth qualification that an elder must have was being orderly. That's being appropriate in behavior or conduct, well ordered. An elder who would flirt with women, tell off-colored jokes, show preferential treatment to members of the body of Christ, and so forth, would be not eligible to be an elder. And also this dressing or appearance of orderly has a lot to do with dress and appearance and how they maintain themselves. They don't want to dress flashy, and then on the opposite end, an elder wouldn't want to dress sloppy either. So that designation of being orderly is something that someone needs to look at this person and find that, you know, that man has it together. He's going to be have everything in order as that is within his life. So that was the one item that I missed. So if we, any questions or comments on the first 12? I know that Joy told me that maybe I didn't give people enough time to talk last week or make any comments, but any questions or comments on the first 12 from last week? Or want me to go over anything? Okay, we'll move on to verses 3, 4 through 5. Okay, one who rules his house, his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? So we have this idea of ruling his house well. So this is some designation of presiding over, how he governs his house. Some other definitions are superintend. In construction, the superintendent runs the project. Everything goes through the superintendent. So this is basically the qualification that must be fit by the man. The bishop's wife and children will be in subjection in his home. This man's children will not be seen and heard addressing and responding to their father, or will be seen responding to their father's commands or direction with a sense of gravity. Some other words for gravity was majesty or dignity, dignified seriousness. So do we have, is that something that's not really seen much in society today? You know, if you're in society and maybe even within the church, how do children react to their father? These are things that, you know, as a congregation that we need to look at. You know, me speaking personally, so with my son, so it wasn't necessarily that he didn't show me respect as he got older, but something was different that caused him to, you know, fall away. So, but that's a responsibility, and that's something that's so important as an elder that we need to take seriously, because there's something amiss if you're basically going to be taking over the family of God. You're going to be looking over that. And that's why I've got that highlighted, must be, because that man has to rule the church. And if that man hasn't had that experience, and if there's something in his life, the family is a trial. It's a place that we can see how this man rules his house. So if you have a man that's not controlling his children, or if there's something like that, what's he going to do in the church? And that's so much more important and within the family because that's affecting so many souls. So we have to be able to discern that. We can't be flippant, and again, I'm going to say must be because I think that that's so important. And the children, it's a trying ground. I mean, I kind of look at it like this, and this is opinion. So, and people, if you guys have other opinions, that's fine. I look at it, if you have, let's say someone has 5 children. If one of those children fall away, I look at it in the church. How many people fall away in the church? A lot, right? Does that mean that the elders were failures? No. So same way we look at, the father in the house. If a father has 5 children and one of those children fall away, personally, I don't think that disqualifies that man. If he's got 4 out of 5, we would love to have a 4 out of 5 ratio in the church. Now, when I looked at my situation, I had 2. So if one falls away, when I'm looking at that ratio, that's not a good ratio. Was I lucky with the one and unlucky with the other, or was it vice versa? Was I lucky the one that chose? Was that because she was a good person? Go ahead.
God gives us free will, and we're
right.
to train our children. And I know that you did.
Right.
And so he chose.
Right.
So that's not on you. I understand that you feel responsible
right.
for that and stuff, but that doesn't reflect on you. And,
right.
And one kid's just as important as if you had 5.
Right.
So
Well, I kind of look at it. I look at it different. I just look at it like with common sense. I'm looking at ratio. If I would have had 3 children, would 2 of them failed? Or if I'd had 4 children, would 3 of them failed and 1 of them was good? I'm saying with that, I wouldn't want to take that risk. And I wouldn't want to take that risk with God's church. And so that was how I looked at that. I look at what the intention of these verses are as far as having a strong congregation. I know of congregations where I don't feel that the elders, I don't know if any of them are really eligible, but they're elders. And I don't think that congregation struggles, but I don't know, how that's going to work in God's eyes. I wouldn't want to be, when it says must be, we don't want to take a risk with that. And that's how I look at those things. I wouldn't want to, say, hey, at the end of time when I pass, is if I have to answer for that, well, why did you do that? I clearly say this. And so because we also, like I said in last week in Acts chapter 9, we use that verse where Paul was told must be, or you must do these things to be saved. We use that in our Christian walk to teach people. You must do these things. They can't say, well, I did most of those things. It has to be all or nothing. And that's kind of how I looked at that. And it's up for debate. There's a lot of opinion on children, how many children, what's the responsibility, just like you said. If, people know that I'm faithful, people know that, if you want to call it checking a box, I check all the boxes, but I feel that part I didn't. And that's where I, personally, I feel responsible for that. And I understand, I've heard that argument too, but we got to be careful just because of that must be. Any comments on the children? So again, that just tells us how important when we raise our children in the church, when we're teaching our children, it's kind of a responsibility to tell these kids that when they have dads that are in the church and working in the church, you have a big responsibility as a child, and we need to, as a church, ingrain that in them. Any comments further on children?
I think when we're looking at these qualifications, I think it's important for the individual that is considering to be an elder to first consider what his situation. People can look from the outside in and say, oh yeah, he's a good candidate for an elder, or
right.
He's not a good candidate. But they may not know all the intricacies regarding that individual and his
Sure.
relationship, and but the man should know, who's considering the office.
Right.
And I think it's really conducive for a person that's considering that to really look inwardly, look at these qualifications, study them, and kind of make an assessment of his own qualifications. I think that's very important for individuals first to do that's considering that. But I think also he needs to consider how others, we see throughout the scriptures, which you probably have already gotten to last week, but where he has to have a good reputation from
Sure.
those that are without, those outside the church.
Mhm.
What are they going to think about a man who maybe they look at their children, maybe they work with their child, and
Right.
they're going to consider, oh, he's an elder in the church,
Right.
and his son or daughter is like this.
Right.
That's the things that I think about.
Right.
And in the Titus, if you look at the Titus, I think it's interesting that in those qualifications that it talks about being blameless twice
Right.
in that passage.
Yep.
One in reference to, after talking about being blameless, it talks about their spouse and their children.
Right.
And then it goes on to talk about being blameless, I think, as an individual. Why was it necessary for blameless to be mentioned twice in that passage? Well, I think there's an importance of your spouse and your children, how people perceive those in your role as an elder. So
Right.
I think those are things to consider as well.
Marcy?
It puts so much pressure on the kids of elders.
Yeah.
And
There's
preachers.
a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And I really feel like the children should have an opportunity to get through their formative years before a person decides to be an elder, because there's so much pressure.
Probably good suggestion.
Yeah.
And too, the thing is though, the qualifications that God is asking for should be what every
Yeah.
Christian man should strive for. And I think that it's set up so that obviously that the church can be strong. And maybe some of the problems that we have in the church, where we have divisions and liberalism and things moving in, and like the Christian church coming into play, hundreds of years ago, but those things, maybe that was because people started kind of getting flippant with the qualifications of eldership. And it's just something that's not taken lightly. It's something that, and when a man's seeking that, he needs to have that, desire to do and fulfill those things. And it's like our young men that are, teenagers. There's things that they may get involved in now that could affect that later. And, the raising them to pick the right wife, not to get in situations that's going to cause them to fail in one of these qualifications. And it's not like you can't be forgiven. And I don't want us to overlook that. There's things that we can do growing up, and we can be forgiven of that. And as we're going to get into about being blameless, we can be forgiven of those things and still be qualified to be an elder. But I just think it's important that, and I want to share a little bit of my personal opinion, and because I still have people in the church that kind of, not exactly what you said, Tammy, but just other, just saying that, oh, well, why? And kind of like what John says, it's, people outside the world might know my son, but not know my daughter. And, there's not a, that's what you got to look at and go from there. Let's see. Okay, so we gotta pay attention to those, how they treat their dad or their father in public, and then also the same man. There's times that you got to look at how the wife treats the man. Also, the wife that same man often smiles or laughs at his wife and children when they display an attitude of disrespect. You know, if a wife kind of makes fun of, or if a husband makes a comment and she's like, and then turns to her friends and says, that guy's an idiot, I'm not gonna, that man doesn't, in a godly sense, doesn't have control over his own house. And those are things that the wife has to be someone that's not going to be argumentative. And I'm not talking about standard things. I'm talking about, this is all regarding with religious or Christian faith. And we have to go with the Bible. But the wife's not going to argue with the husband over things that are pertaining to the church or how the family should run, as long as he's within Scripture. You know, obviously there's a whole lot of, we can go down a big rabbit hole of how a husband is supposed to treat the wife, and you know, we're not, elders would be the first one, I know the elders here too would be the first ones to tell someone if they're getting abused by their husband, get away from the husband. Not divorce the husband, but get away from the husband, because that needs to be handled. That situation needs to be handled. So I'm just talking about the respect or disrespect that with regards to how the wife and how the children treat the father. So many men today speak and their wives give them a dirty look. They argue with their husband. They chide him. They do all but submit to him. And there's women that are like that. They're, you know, I don't care what he says. I'm not going to do what he says. Well, that man is not fit to be an elder. And then in Titus 1:6, here. So we're going to get into kind of what John mentioned. If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Now, this is not saying this blameless, we kind of defined it a little bit last week. It's not someone that's perfect. It's just someone that doesn't have any sin or inward thoughts or anything, like John said, or something that someone can come back and say, well, that guy acts like this or that outside of the church. I've seen him do this or that outside of the church, and that's where that's getting at. And so this affects also how the wife and the children treat him. Also, I found it interesting in this the commentary that I used, and I've heard this argued differently. In fact, recently I had some really good preachers that I heard. But this is another item, and this is something that we can discuss. It says a man whose wife leaves him in adultery, argues with him, throws pouting fits of rage, anger, walks upon him, and shows disdain and disrespect, is not fit for the office of bishop. So I found it interesting because, you know, in the church, if someone's caught in adultery, you can put them away, and you're eligible to remarry. But the fact that if you're married to someone and they committed adultery, that will disqualify you. Even if you marry again and it's a scriptural marriage, that relationship, because that shows a failure as you as a husband. And I argue this all the time. When two people, if there's a divorce and it's a scriptural divorce, I never think that it's 100% one person. There's something that failed, and if it failed on both sides. And so that's something that the man, it's another example of ruling his house well within the church. As a man, if your relationship has failed and then she had an affair or whatever, there's something that failed within that management of that house. But I found that interesting because I never thought about that till I read that. Any comments on that? Agreed? All right.
Tony?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, one thing about that is communication.
Yep.
I mean, if an adultery situation happens, there was probably months and months and months that went by where one or both of them weren't communicating what their needs were to each other.
Sure.
And that's not good, because as an elder, we have to be able to communicate our needs to, the fellow elders and the deacons and the other members and the preacher. And communication is a huge part of being a Christian in general.
Sure.
And so being a leader of a group of Christians, we have to be known as being good communicators. And so if a relationship breaks down, it can almost always be fixed, especially if you're both Christians, with some communication, some constant, effortful communication.
Yeah. And think about, I like what you just said, that just sprung into my head. So if someone came to me, and let's say I was serving as an elder, and someone came to me and said, hey, this certain religious body is doing this and that, and I'm like, yeah, we'll talk about it later, and I just blew it off, and then 6 months later, that person's attending that church. Well, now they're committing spiritual adultery, right? And so that's kind of that example that we have. So it's something to consider. But yeah, that's a good point, Michael. Any other comments on that? I think I got through that enough. So, and finally, what happens in the home says much about the man. So that's one thing when we, as a congregation, when we consider men, this is a big thing that we need to look at. Okay. Verse 6. I'll just go ahead and read verse 6 through verse 7. Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall under reproach and a snare of the devil. So, not a novice being puffed up, lest he fall into the condemnation of the devil. So, Paul said to Timothy, is that the bishop must not be a novice, newly or recently planted, a neophyte, one newly implanted into the Christian church, a new convert. So if you have somebody, that's the other thing that as a congregation, when we're looking, someone could be old. When I say old, older, they could meet all the qualifications, but if they're a new convert, they wouldn't be qualified. And we find that because they can fall into the condemnation of the devil. But why do you think, what are some of the things we went over last week that a man that is older, when he's looking at that, what are some of the things that he has to be able to do that a novice probably can't do? Someone that's been maybe a member of the church for a year or so. And why would that be? Where does the devil fit in on those lack of attributes?
Have to teach.
Have to teach. Very good. What else? There's another one that's close to that. It's probably not up there.
I don't know what you guys talked about last week. I was gone, but in Titus it talks about holding the faith, being able with sound doctrine, both to exhort and reprove those. So he needs to be someone who's well versed in doctrine and scriptures to be able to do that.
And so negate the gainsayer, right? Yeah. So being able to, a novice probably would not be able to, if someone came to him with some kind of a false teaching that may be close to what we practice, but it's not scriptural, if they're a novice, they're not going to be able to defend that and defend the church and protect the church. So those are the things about being a novice, but one can have all of those attributes, but not have that ability to apt to teach or convict the gainsayer, and being able to stop those who err. Because if you don't have that knowledge, you're not going to be able to do that. Also, one could become puffed up, swelled chest of pride, an achievement of being a bishop rather than looking to the seriousness of the duty that lies before him. And I can tell you that none of our elders are puffed up, and if I think it's kind of comical because it's the elder is the highest office that God obtains, but it's the lowest position. And what I mean by that is because the elder is to serve everybody, it's basically a reverse. So it's a reverse pyramid. The elder's serving all those above him instead of on top and, dictating those things. He's a servant. And that's the one thing that that a novice may not recognize, is that, oh, I'm in charge now. I'm the guy. Well, that's not necessarily you are in charge, but it's a matter of servitude and looking out for the congregation and the well-being of the congregation. Any more on being a novice? Okay. So the other one that John brought up, and this is another good one. Moreover, he must have good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Again, bishops mentioned by Paul to Timothy is that they have a good testimony from in or outside. So the man needs to have an appearance of godliness more than just in the presence of the church and those around him, but at work, with your neighbors, and I like this, and this is something we don't do here, and it's something that John, you guys might consider. This suggested that they actually interview people outside of the church that know the man that wants to become an elder, like maybe call his office and ask him some questions. What do you think about this guy? What does he do for you at work, or how does he react? Is he the guy wearing the lampshade at the office party, or is he doesn't go to the office parties? And those are the type of things that we have to look at, and that's something that we need to consider. I know, and I don't say these things, I'm not bragging or doing anything like that. I know at my work, people know that I don't like hearing foul language. They'll have events happening, and they don't even ask me if I want to go, because they know that I don't participate in those type of activities. And I've even been asked on certain jobs, because the job was at a certain facility or a place. They even asked me, said, now, does this go against how you believe? Because we won't make you do it if it does. And so those type of things, they're, how you carry yourself outside, the church. Because it's easy to be a Christian at church, right? And most men can, hey, I know of examples after examples, members that are here that aren't even right now. They don't behave as Christians outside of the church. So we've got to look at that, how that man is viewed outside, because he can fall into reproach and a snare of the devil. And if you have somebody that's already questionable outside, his example at the church, how do you teach someone that may be practicing things outside, and if you're going along with it outside the church, you're not going to have any ability to correct his actions or her actions. Any questions or comments on how the elder is to look or be outside the church? This is all pretty common sense stuff, but it's just stuff that we need to consider. Yeah.
Because we sort of live such separate lives from each other, we don't really know what's going on.
Yeah.
That would be a really hard one to know about.
Yeah, without investigating, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't really, we all live such separate lives.
Yeah.
We don't really know what's going on in people's lives.
Yeah. I know there's a pretty good group of guys that we, golf together, or we'll do things together, and you can kind of get, that's why I like, there's some things like I'm not good for progressive dinners. I'm not into those type of things, but those are activities, activities outside the church, and our fellowship outside the church is a good way to see how people react. I know we played basketball together. John and I did in leagues and stuff. And that basketball is a sport that, test all your emotions, right? So those are things that you can kind of see how a guy reacts in situations when a referee calls a bad foul or something like that, and you get a pretty good assessment of how people are. But those functions that we have outside the church and getting involved with our friends here, that because you can't hide yourself all the time. So you can do it for a couple hours, but you get outside, you can't really hide that.
You know, just going back to what I said, you know, an individual needs to self-assess themselves, and I think a lot of these are for the man who is considering it.
Yep.
That's not to say that those outside can also, you know, look at this and make judgment whether an individual would be qualified. I mean, the eldership is a congregation appointment. It's not the elder's appointment of a man they want. It's the congregation. And so that's why we ask the congregation, you know, if you have any objections, please submit them.
Yeah.
And we ask when they're being appointed, if you agree to stand up because it is a congregation.
Right.
But the individual, you know, also has to make this assessment. And I believe these qualifications are for them to look internally and determine that. And, you know, I would hate to, and I think about this a lot, I would hate to stand before God and, you know, out of deceit or saying like, oh, I just wanted to do this.
Right.
I never considered the qualifications because, you know, I just wanted to, you know, I wanted to be an elder. So I would hate to stand before God knowing our heart, our thoughts, stand before Him and have to answer, well, I just did this because I wanted to, or because I thought people would look up to me, or something like, whatever the reason is. I would hate to stand before God on the day of judgment and have to give an account because I acted in some deceitful way in evaluating these qualifications.
Right. And I think that's part of that desire, right? If you desire that's more than just, hey, I want to be an elder. That's living your life in such a manner or developing. When I was a deacon, and then when my kids were young, and so studying more and you grow and those type of things, when you start thinking, you know, it's a Christian man's responsibility to be an elder. I think that should be this opinion. That should be every Christian's man's desire is to be an elder. And as you grow, you're going to develop. I mean, I promise you, when I was young, my temper is way different than it is now. I mean, I was a hothead. I'd fly off the handle. That was something that I had to physically work at. You're not born with these attributes. You have to work at those things, and that's part of that desire, right? I mean, we have to really look at, man, okay, here's the qualifications. What do I need to work on? You know, maybe I'm not very orderly, like the first part we talked. Maybe I dress like a slob, and maybe my appearance isn't good. I've got stuff or paperwork everywhere. I need to work on that. I need to appear orderly in front of the congregation. Given the hospitality, you know, that's something else that people. I'm not real. I like people. I'm social. I'm weird about, like, I don't like going to people's houses and spending the night unless it's my mom or dad or something. I'm just weird about that stuff. So being hospitable, you have to be able to invite people into your house and, you know, share all the things that you own. That's part of that. That's stuff that you have to work on. Apt to teach. You have to be willing to do that as an individual. And that's, as you're growing in that, and John, like you're saying, I'm just adding that to that, is that desire. You've got to develop and work on, you know, all of those attributes.
One more thing.
Yep.
There's probably a lot of guilt in the fact that desiring the office. There's got to be a lot of guilt there, because what if, you know, you're in a position where you don't feel qualified, then you think, well, I should be desiring the office. And so that could be why some people maybe are going to be an elder too soon.
Yeah.
Because they can't handle that guilt
Right.
Not wanting to do it, be of service.
Right. I can understand that. Yep. That is something though, if they do desire, like, I don't think there's an age limit. I think that, you know, someone could be at a certain stage in life and still not have some of these, but meet a lot of the qualifications, and maybe they need to work on a few or one of those things. Because that's the other thing. It's not like, hey, I've got, you know, 11 of the 15. It's all of them, right? But it says must be. All right.
And Tony, as we look at this guy, we also need to look at the wife too.
Yep. I thought I
part of
did.
the package.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of focus on the guy, as it should be, as you explained it.
Yes.
If there's a wife that comes along with that, that's
Right.
an incredibly important part
Right.
of that eldership package.
Absolutely. And that's those are the things that, you know, if you desire that, that's something like you just mentioned. You have to have a discussion with your wife.
Big time.
Hey, I'm looking at that, and you know, I had discussions with my kids and my wife. You know, and let them know. It wasn't like I just said, "Hey, I'll be an elder today." Yeah, I mean, you know, you don't. It's something that you have to take into consideration, and the wife has to take it as serious, if not more.
Yeah, because she's going to be hospitable too, right?
Absolutely.
At the home, she's not going to be, well, I'm going with my friends while you entertain these people here.
Yeah.
She's not going to be found blameless by people. That doesn't work.
Right.
You know, because there's that support role there, that foundational. You know, we know the woman in the house is a foundation.
Yes.
In terms of the husband, the children,
Yeah.
managing many of their affairs. That bubbles up into the church too. So, you know, if there's a woman that isn't really qualified,
Right.
in a sense, also not to be a novice as well, and things
Yeah.
like that.
Oh yeah.
It's just not going to happen.
Big
It's
responsibilities.
not going to happen.
And like when we talked about last week, must be the husband of one wife. So that wife has to understand what's happening, what she's getting into, what she's getting ready to expose herself to. The husband
It's the same.
in the eldership, we count on our wives for support, because believe me, there's times in the eldership that you make decisions that aren't very popular within the congregation. And pretty much the only person on your side is your wife and the other elders. You know what I mean? It's like there's just a big responsibility. There's things that you're going to count on your wife. Your wife can't be a busybody. She can't be one that's known to gossip or anything. That is not any part of.
No, because if you think
elder's
like
life.
even with like when you look at the, as an example, the president of the country, you need to look at the wife too.
Yeah.
Because the closest counselor to the president is always the one that pillows her head
Sure.
right next to him.
Absolutely.
So when you got Obama, you got Michelle with it,
Right.
without a doubt.
Right.
And so when you get an elder, you're bringing the wife along too. So your wife,
Absolutely.
she needs to be ready. She needs to understand what she's getting into, and she can't get all these other things as well. You know,
Right. No.
People as qualifications go a lot longer with her.
Sure.
Good mind, not a novice,
Yeah.
blameless. Those type of things. How children view her as well.
Right. And that, like you said, that's
what
all.
makes it so.
Yeah.
It makes it a very, very, very difficult, and why it's really just a few guys, as you mentioned. In a lot of congregations, you see them go, I'm not sure about these guys here,
Right.
It's a very difficult,
Yeah.
as I've spoken to some of you guys about that role, and I know how the reverence that you have for it,
Yeah.
it is not to be taken lightly.
No. And I pointed out that there's things that the elders, there were some things that Joy didn't know. There's some things that the elders keep within that,
Yeah.
but there's so many things that the elders know. Like I said last week, the elders, and I know the elders here too, there's not anything that's going on here that they don't know about. Even though people go, well, this is going on and they haven't done anything, well, that's not true. And so those are the things that like you said, the wife kind of has part of that. So
What if she's not ready? What if she's not ready?
then he's not ready.
Yeah,
And
he's
we would
not
hope
ready.
that he would understand
Yeah.
if she's not ready.
Right.
That would be a bad thing.
Yeah, and she may never be ready, and so therefore he's never.
He's not ready. Yeah. And that's the thing. He desires it. She, as a husband and wife, she needs to desire for him to be an elder.
Yeah.
That's all part of that.
Because
That's
he's
a
going to
good
be
point.
blind at night time too, sometimes, working with the membership. Is she like that?
Right.
That he comes back late,
Yeah.
Yeah. That he's working for the church.
Is he going to the
She's
potlucks and she's going home? Or,
She needs to be ready.
I think what you said, Tony, is probably true for every elder. I haven't spoken to every elder about that before considering the eldership. You need to sit down with your wife and your children
Yep.
and talk about the importance, go over the qualifications.
Yep.
I tell you one thing that is important for me. I sat down with my wife and kids and I said, let's look at the qualifications.
Yeah.
And you guys are the closest to me.
Sure,
me
you know.
better than anyone.
Yeah.
Tell me where I'm lacking in
Yeah.
some of these qualifications. And that can be a humbling experience there doing that.
Yeah, it can be.
You don't always realize maybe
Right.
what others see,
Right.
And so, but it's important for, the man to sit down with his wife and say, look, you guys are going to be held accountable as well for things. People are going to look to you, and, that's going to be a reflection on the eldership.
Right.
And so I think every man needs to sit down with his family and say, this is something I'm considering well before, not just like a week or so, before they're going to do it, but, well before they even submit their name to be a servant like that.
And I think that's why when it talks about must be the husband of one wife, I think that is so binding because of that relationship. That elder or the elders count on your wife. You have to have that support, that supporting role. And I think that's indicative of what that is saying and why we can't get away from must be.
And not only that, I think your wife is vital. I mean, what if you need to go to an erring sister who's a single woman?
Yep.
That's a danger for, one elder, even a couple elders going to that situation. You need your wives in that situation to go to that sister together.
Sure.
And be able to instruct or give advice or whatever the case may be. You need your wife in that situation.
Absolutely. Yep. Anything else? Are you kidding me? All right, so Nick's going to say, you got through 7 verses?
This one always takes a long time. Whenever people teach it always takes a while.
Yeah. So I just real quick, 1 Timothy 3:2 states, this is just basically from the commentary, so I'm just going to read it pretty much verbatim. States as a preamble to the qualification, the phrase the bishop therefore must be, the use of the word must illustrates a binding necessity for that which it qualifies. The elder is therefore bound to meet these qualifications by necessity. So this is a necessity, it's not a suggestion. This is not only possible, it is expected of God. Oftentimes, brethren try to limit the truths of God, claiming there is no way man can meet such qualifications. But I like this, that he did this. So consider what Moses told Israel. So this is in Deuteronomy 30:11-14. For this commandment which I command thee this day, it is not too hard for thee, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven, that thou should say, who shall go up to heaven and bring it to us? So these things aren't somewhere where they're out of reach. And make us to hear it, that we may do it. Neither is it beyond the sea, like on the other side of the ocean, that thou should say, who shall go over to the sea and bring it for us, and bring it back to us, and make us to hear it, that we may do it. But the word is very nigh unto thee, in thy mouth and in thy heart, that thou mayest do it. We have God's word that's telling us what we have to do. And so it's attainable. It's not anything that's out of our reach. Okay. You guys will have Nick starting again next week.